On the darkest days in history, we examine how a chariot race dispute exploded into the Nika Riots massacre that nearly toppled an empire. If you want to understand how urban unrest can threaten empires, subscribe to the darkest days in history. In January 532, Constantinople burned. The blues and greens, rival chariot factions, set aside decades of hatred to unite against Emperor Justinian, chanting a single word: Nika. What began as a protest over a prefect's cruelty became fire, siege, and slaughter on a scale the ancient world rarely witnessed. Would the palace survive the flames? Contrary to the common myth that the Nika riots were caused solely by anger over chariot racing results, the roots of the rebellion ran far deeper. The hidden pressure was taxation. John the Cappadocian, Justinian's prefect, had imposed crushing tax burdens on Constantinople's population. It fueled resentment that had smoldered long before the first stone was thrown. On the 13th of January, 532, the blues and greens, normally bitter rivals, did something unprecedented. They united. Their shared chant, Nika, meaning conquer, echoed through the avenues as they demanded the removal of John the Cappadocian. This was no sports quarrel. Political rivals in the Byzantine Senate seized the opportunity, using the factions to attempt a coup against Emperor Justinian. The unity of the blues and greens transformed typical sports unrest into a political insurrection threatening the throne itself. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Fires erupted across Constantinople, spreading with alarming speed through densely packed timber neighborhoods. The original Hagia Sophia, the great church that stood as a symbol of imperial Christian power, was consumed by the flames. Large districts of the city burned to ash, including parts of the imperial quarter. The destruction highlighted the complete loss of imperial control over the capital. Constantinople civilians watched as their homes, markets, and churches collapsed into smoking ruins. The economic stakes were staggering. The cost of rebuilding the city and the Hagia Sophia would drain the imperial treasury for years. Meanwhile, the imperial palace found itself surrounded by blazing rooftops, an island of vulnerability amid the inferno. Emperor Justinian looked out from his besieged residence at a capital he could no longer command, flames reflecting on the Bosporus. Inside the imperial palace, the council chamber was thick with fear. Emperor Justinian's advisors urged flight, arguing that the city was lost and that the emperor should abandon Constantinople for safety. The myth persists that the emperor fled during the crisis, but the truth is more dramatic. It was Empress Theodora who stopped the retreat. Rising before the council, she declared that death in power was preferable to fleeing into exile. She reminded those present that purple, the color of imperial robes, made the finest shroud. Her words carried the weight of someone who understood that abdication meant execution. Theodora's influence was the decisive factor in Justinian's decision to stay and fight. Her speech marked the point of no return. The emperor would not run. He would order a counteroffensive. Tell us in the comments which clue about the Nika Riots massacre feels most convincing so far. But while the council debated, the crisis escalated beyond protest into outright revolution. Amid the burning streets, the mob surged into the Hippodrome, the vast arena adjoining the imperial palace. There, on the sand where charioteers had raced, the crowd proclaimed Hypatius, a member of the imperial lineage, as emperor. This act transformed the unrest from a protest into a full-scale succession crisis. The chariot faction members, Constantinople civilians, and sympathetic senators who filled the stands had chosen their man. Hypatius, whether willing or reluctant, was now the figurehead of a coup. The imperial family faced not merely a riot, but a rival court. The Byzantine Senate, or at least a faction within it, had thrown its support behind the pretender. Justinian's throne was no longer merely threatened by fire and mob violence. It was contested by a declared rival, with a legitimate claim to the purple. The open question was whether he could survive a rival emperor, crowned in his own hippodrome, within sight of his palace walls. The myth that Justinian planned the massacre from the beginning to crush dissent ignores the reality of a cornered emperor acting out of desperation. The decision to strike was born not from calculation, but from survival. General Belisarius, the empire's most capable commander, was tasked with restoring order. On the 18th of January, 532, imperial troops gathered around the Hippodrome while the crowd inside, still celebrating their proclaimed Emperor Hypatius, had no idea what was coming. Belisarius moved imperial troops to trap the crowd inside the Hippodrome. Before the massacre began, the chariot faction members and Constantinople civilians who had filled the stands found themselves caught in a killing ground. Imperial soldiers advanced through the enclosed arena, cutting down the trapped crowd with systematic efficiency. The emotional stakes were absolute. The terror of being trapped in the Hippodrome, with no escape, and the realization that Nika had led not to victory but to annihilation. Casualty estimates place the dead at roughly 30,000 people. The Hippodrome, once the heart of Constantinople's public life, became a site of mass death. The massacre effectively ended the political power of the chariot factions forever. The blues and greens, which had shaped imperial politics for centuries, were reduced to mere sporting clubs, stripped of meaningful political influence. Hypatius was captured and executed. The social fabric of the city was torn apart, with entire neighborhoods mourning their dead. Justinian had survived, but the cost was measured in lives lost where chariots once raced. The Nika Riots massacre was not merely the suppression of a riot, it was the deliberate elimination of dissent through mass death. A demonstration that the imperial throne would tolerate no challenge. He reigned for decades more, codifying Roman law into a system that influenced legal traditions for centuries. The city was rebuilt grander than before, with a new Hagia Sophia rising from the ruins of the old, its dome surpassing anything the ancient world had seen. The memory of the massacre silenced opposition for a generation. The chariot factions, once kingmakers, were reduced to entertainment, never again daring to challenge the throne. Our focus on the Nika Riots massacre demonstrates how urban unrest can threaten empires, and the extreme measures taken to preserve power. The parallels to modern urban riots, state responses to protest, and the fragility of political stability remain stark. If this exploration of the Nika Riots and imperial survival deepened your understanding of how power is held or lost, subscribe to The Darkest Days in History for more examinations of the darkest moments humanity has recorded. The Hippodrome falls silent, the dead are remembered, and the throne endures. But the question of what it costs to hold power echoes across centuries.